J'espère que vous avez pris un bon moment de déjeuner et de partage. On a organisé pour que tout le monde puisse discuter. It was a time to discuss. Et maintenant, j'ai le plaisir de vous présenter le professeur Jasone Cenoz, qui vient de l'Université du Pays Basque, qui revient de professeur invité à l'Université de Chicago, qui est spécialiste du plurilinguisme, et bien sûr avec le basque, avec l'espagnol. C'est vraiment, on a beaucoup de chance d'avoir des collègues qui peuvent nous parler de ces langues. So it's an honor for us, Jasone. Et Jasone va nous faire la conférence en anglais avec le diaporama en espagnol, le slideshow in Spanish. So, merci beaucoup.
Merci. Eskerrik asko, arratsaldeon. Eskerrak nahi dizkiot antolatzailei ona konbidatzeagatik eta aukera emateagatik zuekin nire lana partekatzeko. That was Basque, yes. Bonsoir. That was Basque. I will go on in English, but I wanted to start in Basque, which is one of the languages spoken here in France. I'm going to talk about pedagogical translanguaging and breathing spaces for minority languages. So first, I was saying, by the way, in Basque, that I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here and to have the possibility of sharing my work with you. I'm going to start giving a bit of the context of the Basque Country. I come from the Basque Country, but from, let's say, the Spanish side, but I will explain now. So the context of the Basque Country is on both sides of the Pyrenees, and most of it is in the Spanish side, but there are three provinces in France that we call Lapurdi, Navarre, Ben Nafarroa, and Zuberoa. For those of you with some cities, we are talking about Donibane Loitzun, which is Saint-Jean-de-Luz, Donibane Garasi, Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, Maule, that we call Maule, in Zuberoa. So we are talking about the very southwest of France, in the case of the French Basque Country, that we refer to as the north side, which is Iparralde in Basque. Ipar is north, alde is side, Iparralde. Okay, the rest of the Basque Country is in the Spanish state, and it has two different autonomies. One is the Basque Autonomous Community, with cities like Bilbao, San Sebastian, Vitoria, and the other one is Navarre, with the city of Pamplona, Pampelune. But Navarre only, let's say the more north part is, there is a big difference between the north and the south, and there are even different laws about Basque in the north and the south. But going back in time, we have the first texts in Basque are in the same book as the first text in Spanish. So the glosas emilianenses, the first sentences, we will say, or real sentences. The glosas emilianenses are very well known for being the first written prose in Spanish. It's not here you have a picture, but it's not, the text is in Latin, but the notes on the side are in Spanish. But some of these notes, it seems that the monks at the time were, copying and whatever, and adding some of their explanations, and those are in Spanish, but some are in Basque. And so we have these sentences in Basque. But just in November 2022, we got to know that we have a sentence that was much older, 2,000 years. It was found a bit earlier, but it was made public in November 2022, and it's the hand of Irulegi. And this one is from the 1st century before Christ, and there are a kind of, not a full sentence, but what seems to be a sentence in Basque, and it was, so that's even older. But of course, I say all this because Basque was already there before French or Spanish or Latin, right? And we can see that in some, when we compare languages, well, French is not here, but you know that it's also similar to Spanish in this case, that we have like family names, like Aita, Ama, Semea, Lava, Anaya, Arreba, or Aispa, depending if it's the sister of a man or sister of a woman and things like that. And in Spanish, the same as we have in French with père, mère, fils, fil, and so on. We have, or in English, in English is more different, but still father, for example, is related because they are Indo-European languages, even if English is Germanic and French and Spanish are Romance languages. Basque is not. Of course, it has had a lot of influence from French and from Spanish, because our neighbors have been very powerful and are very powerful, compared to Basque. But Basque is considered by many people a difficult language to learn because, it has declensions, but we have declensions in other languages as well. But it's also the ergative, for you, some of you, if you're working with linguistics, that the subject of a transitive verb needs a special declension that it doesn't need if the verb is intransitive. So if I buy apples, I need to say Jasone. And if I go for a walk, I just say Jasone. Okay, so that's interesting. Well, what is the situation? We have quite good surveys, but it's for the population over the age of 16. And we have had them from 1991 to 2021, even though it's not completely published. There are only some data of this last one. And it is very good because we can make comparisons. And the surveys look at the knowledge of the language, transmission, if it's used in the family as transmission, the use of the language, and attitudes. And we have a survey for the Basque Autonomous Community, another one for Navarre, and another one for Iparralde, or the northern Basque Country in France. So what we see is that from 1991, that we have the first survey, to now, there are more speakers of Basque. This is important, mainly when we have, the population is not going up that much. We have a very low birth rate and so on. But, and if the population is maintaining, it's more with non-speakers of Basque coming to the country from other countries. So it has gone from 22% to 28%. We are talking about people who are over the age of 16. It's higher with younger people because they go to school, and many of them through the medium of Basque. But now, there are important differences. If we look at the three areas, Basque Autonomous Community, that's, as I said, where Bilbao, San Sebastian, Vitoria are, Navarre, and Iparraldea, that's the French side, we see that the development is not the same. The total is very positive, but in the French side, you can see that it's very negative. It's not going well. It's gone down from 1991, and these data are from 2021. The other, I didn't have the total, has not been published, so I showed you the most recent I had. That was 2016, I think, but this one is 2021, and it's gone down from 28.7 to 20.1. While in the Basque Autonomous Community, it's gone up from 24.1 to 36.2. So there is, and Navarre has gone up also a bit, but not as much, and is lower. So this is interesting, and it is linked in many ways to education, to language policy in general, that because in the Basque Autonomous Community, there is a strong language policy to protect and develop the Basque language in all sectors, not only in education, but the main reason is education. So let's go to education, and let's go to the Basque Autonomous Community, okay? Where the measures of the legislation is protecting the Basque language more. So we have three linguistic models, A, B, and D. Traditionally, there was no C letter in the Basque alphabet, that's the D. And we have Spanish as the medium of instruction in A, in B is Basque and Spanish, and in D is Basque. So the medium of instruction for all subjects, except language, or for you, if you use language arts. So every child in the Basque Autonomous Community has Spanish as a subject, Basque as a subject, and a foreign language that is almost always English as a school subject in every year, okay? Apart from that, French is used to be the most common foreign language, but now it's not, but it is a fourth language in secondary optional, an optional fourth language, and it's relatively popular as an optional fourth language. So it is not compulsory to go to one of these models. It's optional, but of course, sometimes there are a few restrictions if there is only one family who wants to send their child to one of the models, but it's even possible to go to another town and the government will pay for transport if that person, that family wants one language instead of the other. And the data in the Basque Autonomous Community is that we have that the green there, you see, that is the model. Basque medium is the most common in primary school and in secondary school. And it goes to 76% and 72% in secondary. It's usually, I mean, there are very few cases that is changing from primary to secondary. It is getting always a bit more, and that's why it's a bit lower in secondary. But you see that Spanish medium is really low, and then the B model with Basque and Spanish, some subjects in Basque and some in Spanish, is more or less stable in the last years, but the main language of instruction is Basque. Okay, but that doesn't mean, well, very good, so many Spanish-speaking children or children speaking other languages go to Basque medium education, okay? It is very positive and it's very good for the minority language. But there are big challenges with that. It's not all celebration of this. So we see that the use of Basque in the same survey, we see that most people in the Basque Autonomous Community, or Comunidad Autónoma del País Vasco, they speak Spanish. They communicate in Spanish according to the way they report in the survey. These are, of course, it's not school data. This is over the age of 16. And we have that is 60%, and only 22% use more Basque than Spanish or as much Basque as Spanish. So we see that even if it is the language of instruction, there is a big challenge and still is in a difficult situation in terms of language use. We see that there is a study with all the children in the, I think it was in the 4th year of primary and the 2nd of secondary, that they were looking at which language, they were reporting which language, and this is at school, they were using in the D model, Basque medium. Basque medium that ideally was thought to be that you use Basque because you are learning through the medium of Basque. And what you have is that when they talk to the teacher, it's true that 86% of the children in primary use Basque, 80% in secondary, but when they are talking about themselves, they use 56% use Basque, 56.9, and 30% in secondary use Basque. So they communicate among themselves mainly in Spanish, not in Basque. Because, of course, they have attracted, the D model with Basque as the medium of instruction has attracted a lot of Spanish speakers. So they feel more comfortable communicating in Spanish. This is sometimes seen as, but it is, if you attract a lot of Spanish speakers, they are going to use the language they feel more comfortable. So nowadays, Basque is still considered one of the endangered languages. It's at the level of vulnerable. I mean, it's a scale and there are other levels. But let's say that it is a language that is still at risk and that needs protection. And we see how the decline is very sharp when there is no protection. So we have to consider also that students, Basque students nowadays, is a different situation from the time when these models and all these systems started after, started in the, there were ikastola, that were Basque medium schools, kind of half tolerated before, but the main system started in the early 80s after the dictatorship of Franco was over and there was a new constitution and Basque became official co-official with Spanish in the Basque Autonomous Community, and then there were new regulations, new laws, and so on. But nowadays, what we have is that there is diversity, linguistic diversity, more linguistic diversity than before in the class. Basque is the first language or the second, but also in some cases the third or the fourth language for some students because of immigration. There are multiple identities. I mean, it's not so much you are Basques, you are Spanish. No, you can be Basque, feeling Basque and Spanish, you can feel Basque, Spanish, European, you can feel different nationalities. I mean, and there is the use of Basque, Spanish, and other languages. And of course, English is also quite important. And so there are still challenges, even though there are also important achievements. And it is first that you have Basque as the main medium of instruction, but you can also study medicine or chemistry in Basque at the University of the Basque Country and in other universities. You can study all the subjects. You can have a PhD in Basque about something else. In the past, it used to be only about Basque, but a PhD in Basque biology, for example. I mean, it can be used at the highest levels, and you can go to the judge and speak Basque and say, I want to speak Basque and not Spanish. I mean, you can do these things. And there are many speakers of Spanish and other languages that have learned or are learning Basque. And of course, this has meant an enormous development of the language, of the materials for schools, for universities. I mean, schools, it's already quite a long time that this is happening. And let's say there are many materials, even though you need to renew materials all the time. But university with so many different courses is really a real challenge. So but it's possible. And in most cases, except in some technical studies, it's possible to get all subjects through the medium of Basque. Of course, with the option of Spanish for those who want the same studies in Spanish. And in some cases, it could be that one or two subjects here and there have to be in Spanish because there is no teaching staff for that. And then, of course, in learning, there is in education, as we said, but also there are euskaltegis, which is the adult schools for Basque. So there is all this situation of coming from trying to improve the level of Basque, the number of speakers, and now what happens with translanguaging in all this? How do we link all this to translanguaging? First, a few things about translanguaging. We can say that it comes a bit we can compare monolingual views that we have had in the past to multilingual views, these ideas that languages are contaminating each other, and languages, more multilingual would be to say that languages are reinforcing each other. The aim was, we thought, okay, if you have two languages, you have to be a perfect speaker of a native speaker of both languages, or if you have 3 or 4 or whatever, as we do, and nowadays it's more like a multilingual people use their languages in different ways, and they have different skills as compared to monolingual, or the idea that monolingual societies are the example, the reference, and we say, no, those nowadays, they are not real. Societies are multilingual, not monolingual. So we look at, oh, sorry, I thought it was, here's. Okay, we look at the social context. In that sense, we look at the social context where the multilingual speakers are, and the idea of using the repertoire, the multilingual repertoire that they have as multilingual speakers, okay? And in that, when we think about translanguaging, and here Li Wei has already mentioned the origin of translanguaging with Ken Williams in 1994 is when he used it for the first time, and he defined it as a pedagogical practice that was switching the language of the input and the output in bilingual classes. That was in the context of Wales, where Welsh and English are used as languages of instruction, and the models are there are different models also, and they are quite similar. I mean, the situation that we have with education in the Basque Autonomous Community and in Wales are the closest in Europe, because the two languages are different, because there are options for the students to study through the medium of, in Wales, English, or Welsh, in the Basque Autonomous Community, Basque or Spanish, and because it is a minority, regional minority languages that are in a weaker position than other languages, for example, such as Catalan. They are in a weaker position. Welsh is a bit weaker than Basque right now, and we share a lot, and we have a lot of contact with Welsh because of that. And there is in both cases, we can talk about asymmetry of the majority language in Welsh being English, and Welsh being the small language, the same as we have Spanish and Basque. In both cases, we can talk, I mean, apart from recent years and the cases of immigration that in some cases they are not in the programs with the minority language as the language of instruction, but we can talk about when these programs were developed, and in all these years, there is not an idea of race, because like in the Basque Country, as it is in Welsh, we are not talking, except for recent immigration, we are not talking about different races there. I mean, you can have somebody in the Basque Country in the D model that his or her parents spoke Basque, and it has been lost in the family because it was not used in the public space, and that's not a different race from the neighbor whose parents spoke Basque. And the same will be if you think, for example, you then say if somebody who goes to a child who goes to Icastola in Saint-Jean-de-Luz and a child who's from Bordeaux. We are not talking about different races or the ones who speak Basque at home in Maule or in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, for example, and it's not a different race. So it's a different. Sometimes, I mean, we are talking about racial linguistics and so on. We could apply that, but perhaps only in the case if we are talking about recent immigration, not about. We cannot talk about so much about that in the case of this program. So that it has in common. And another thing that it has in common, and that's important, is that translanguaging is planned in both cases. Translanguaging is the teacher in Wales, or the teacher in Wales, and the way Ken Williams used it was that there was a different language for input and output. It's not exactly all the time like that. I have read his thesis to check exactly how he does it. And for example, I mean, he has an example of the Industrial Revolution where he has pictures, he has some text in English, some text in Welsh, and then some exercises have to be done in Welsh and other in English. So it's not only I always hear something in Welsh and I answer in English. It can be in the same exercise, it can change in the input and in the output. But the idea is, and according to Lewis and Colin Baker and Jones, is that translanguaging requires a deeper understanding than just translating, and it moves from finding parallel words to processing and relaying meaning and understanding. So what Ken Williams also says in one of his publications is that in bilingual context, it's also, I mean, it can happen, and he was saying, it's like if you have father and son at home, and somebody phones, and they speak always Welsh, and the person who phones speaks English. The son gets the phone and then tells the father who it was. So there is in Welsh, because that's the language they usually use, or they are watching something in English, but they make a comment in Welsh. So this is the type of thing that also is also done outside the classroom. And yeah, for Ken Williams, it was kind of the two languages were differentiated clearly, Welsh and English. And there was this idea of the deeper understanding. As Liu Wei this morning, he said it has gone in different directions. Translanguaging is understood in different ways. And one of the most important contributions is, of course, with Ofelia Garcia in the context of New York, of bilingualism in New York. But as Ofelia says, she says, though we borrowed the term translanguaging from the work of Welsh educator Ken Williams, it has developed. And she says it was a Latinx perspective that enabled us to develop a theory of translanguaging, focusing on a transcendence that takes into account three beyonds. So it has been developed in the context of Latinx people living in New York or in the States. And it says beyond named languages, beyond the linguistic system, and beyond a simply additive approach to the education of bilinguals in order to engage their entire dynamic semiotic system. That this is how it has changed from the original concept. So if we look at translanguaging in Wales, we have the idea with Ken Williams, who's there, and to identify successful and planned bilingual pedagogical practices at a school, and then to call them, to define them and call them translanguaging, and then to try to extend them, to implement them because they work. Or that was the perspective that Ken Williams had, that they could work well, this type of practices. If we look at the American way, let's say, even though it has, of course, things in common, the origin is more in observing the practices, the natural and planned bilingual communicative practices in different contexts, define them, characterize them as translanguaging, and then propose their legitimization in a school context. I mean, the idea that the way Latina, Latinx people communicate using elements from Spanish and English, or the name languages Spanish and English, is what should be accepted at a school and should be encouraged, because that, in that context, will give them more confidence, they may have better results, it could have good outcomes in that context. So that is the difference. But now if we look at translanguaging and minority languages, we see that the tradition has been to have hard boundaries between languages, to protect the minority. So to protect the minority by isolation. This comes, I mean, where are the minority languages in Europe, the regional minority languages? In very isolated places in the past. Nowadays, of course, they are not isolated, but if you think about France, you think about Brittany, that's there in the corner, you think about Corsican, or you think about Basque, for example, okay? And the Basque country, of course, nowadays is more touristic, it's industrial for many years now, but it was a place that, for example, the Romans were not interested in. They went to Pamplona, but those were just people there fishing and agriculture, not really interesting, right? So, because they were isolated. And where is Basque spoken most? Well, not in the south of Navarre and not in the south of Vitoria. It's more spoken in the places that are not in contact with the other languages. The same as it's not spoken so much on the coast in Biarritz or in these places, but more in the inner part. Okay, so there is this reason. But of course, in class, it was the idea, we use the minority language, the teacher pretends to be monolingual, and so on. This has some problems. For example, this is from the web, and somebody complaining, young Basque speakers don't dare to use Basque because they have suffered censorship from an early age. They have been accused of using Euskañol. Euskañol is Euskera y Español, like you can have Spanglish or whatever, all the time. Perhaps we have denied them the freshness and freedom they need to find in a language. This has some problems. We have to be aware of that. But, on the other hand, we also have the so-called translanguaging. Rather than solving diglossia, will institutionalize Euskanyol, and I see Basque as a loser. That's another point. So what is happening is that if you say, okay, translanguaging, we are going to encourage translanguaging in all ways or whatever, what we get is that the direction goes not as it can be. If you think about the example, what I said about New York, and there it goes, the practices of the minoritized population goes into the space of English, from the minority to the majority. If you do it in the Basque Country, for example, it will be the other way around. So we will go from the majority to the minority, because the students will go on speaking Spanish without Basque, or perhaps one little word here and there, but their Basque is the one that is going to become Euskanyol, not their Spanish. So because there is this asymmetric situation there. So the idea, it is, of course, a lot of reflection. On the one hand, we know that isolation and monolingual ideologies may have been useful for the preservation and revival of minority languages in the past, but they do not longer benefit minoritized communities in today's society to the same extent, and can even be counterproductive, because we know that students have access to other languages. We live in a globalized world. It's a different situation. But on the other hand, the uncritical celebration of translanguaging without considering the specific characteristics of the social context could result in increasing language loss. So we have to think about this. There are concerns from other countries, from Wales, for example, where Jones and Lewis say that there is a growing concern that allowing the use of English texts for the translanguaging purposes might be a stepping stone for introducing more the majority language. The asynchrony, that the majority language comes more with this. And also, in the context of the US, as highlighted previously, translanguaging in ELE, in English language education, could, albeit unintentionally, result in language loss and further threaten and endangered or indigenous languages. So there are these worries. And the idea is that translanguaging has to be sustainable. It is necessary to soften the boundaries between languages in bilingual and multilingual schools, involving regional minority languages, but it has to be done in a sustainable way. We have to take into account always the situation of the minority language. So I'm going to say a bit about pedagogical translanguaging. We consider two dimensions of translanguaging. One is spontaneous and the other pedagogical. When it is pedagogical, it is planned and it uses resources from more than one language. And when it is spontaneous, it is the way, I use spontaneous translanguaging, of course, when I'm communicating in an informal way or WhatsApping or whatever. And we see them as a continuum. And what we see, focusing on pedagogical translanguaging, I'm not going to talk about the spontaneous translanguaging now. The definition is that it is planned by the teacher, is planned, and it is applied inside the classroom and can refer to the use of different languages for the input and the output, as the idea of Wales, or other planned strategies also based on the use of a student's resources from the whole linguistic repertoire. If you want to see more about this, this is a book that can be downloaded for free. That is Pedagogical Translanguaging. And the idea, it is very important that metalinguistic awareness is developed with pedagogical translanguaging, that the students become aware of the whole linguistic repertoire at different linguistic levels: phonetics, lexicon, morphosyntax, pragmatics, discourse, reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And it is linked to the original Welsh concept of translanguaging, but it includes more pedagogical practices and also more languages, because we work with this at least with 3 or more languages. So, some examples. Here you have a text in Basque, and we are talking not about, this is in a science class in primary. I mean, we work with students that they realize that they link what they already know from other languages, because they are emergent multilinguals, to what they find in this text. This text, of course, we are going, I mean, there will be students who have Basque as a second, third, or fourth language. So some as a first language in the same class, the way it works also in Wales and in the Basque Country. And so we work, for example, in this case, we work with a lexicon, and we work to see how they, with cognates, for example, that looking in Basque, in Spanish, in English, or in other languages, we say, so that if they come from another background, they can also say how these words are said. Of course, they have to get them from, if they find a word, or find the words in the text and then say how they work in other languages. We also work with morphology, for example, and we use also the linguistic landscape for that. And we work with using Basque, Spanish, and English. For example, in this case, the structure of Basque and English are more similar to each other than Spanish, but reflecting about how the language works. We also work at the discourse level, the pragmatic level, and so on, but we work with this with Basque and the other languages, and we have implemented projects like this, and we have analyzed the results of this. Not only, I mean, it's very important in our case to see if it affects Basque, Spanish, English, and content. And we have been working on this. The idea is that if we want translanguaging to be sustainable, we need to do several things. And one of them is to design breathing spaces for the minority language. Another one is to create the need to use the minority language. I don't have so much time to explain all that, how it can be done, or to develop metalinguistic awareness. I have just shown some examples, or to develop language awareness about the situation of the languages, what being multilingual, what other languages are spoken, linguistic biographies, all these things that we do, and to link spontaneous translanguaging to pedagogical activities, if there is a spontaneous translanguaging, to see how we can use it. And just talking about one of them, which is breathing spaces, and this comes from Joshua Fishman, and it is what the minority languages spaces, even, I mean, we can talk about translanguaging spaces, but also breathing spaces for the minority languages. The minority language can be used freely and without the threat of the majority language. It can breathe. That's why it's called breathing space. In a space where only the minority language is spoken, such a space could be a village, and we work in social linguistics with that concept, an area, a classroom, or just a space. I mean, it could be a breathing space that part of the class, now we're going to use only Basque, or only English if they need to practice English. Spanish, they don't usually need to practice so much in the Basque autonomous community. And a minority language, as Fishman said, can be predominant and unharassed. This is shared by Cummins, who couldn't be here, but that he says, it does seem reasonable, talking about immersion programs, to create largely separated spaces for each language within a bilingual or immersion programs, that you also need separation, even if you have translanguaging spaces also. And Ofelia Garcia says, it is important to preserve a space, although not a rigid and static, in which the minority language does not compete with the majority language. And just some final remarks, very quickly. Pedagogical translanguaging links prior knowledge to new knowledge. This is basic in pedagogy. I mean, we learn when we link prior knowledge to new knowledge. It activates resources from the whole multilingual repertoire and develops metalinguistic awareness. And it replaces hard boundaries between languages by soft boundaries between languages. Pedagogical translanguaging is sustainable because it goes beyond the celebration of translanguaging and is rooted in the context of the minority language. and it allows for breathing spaces that create the need to use the minority languages on their own, along with contexts where 2 or more languages can be used. Translanguaging and minority languages. Translanguaging can be compatible with minority languages, but the important thing is that it's not seen for some reason. Translanguaging pedagogies are compatible, but the implementation needs to be tailor-made for a specific context, taking into account the language used in the wider social context and the aims regarding the protection and promotion of minority languages. So I wanted to show you, I'm not going to show the video now, we have enough with several things, but if you write, let's make the most of multilingualism in YouTube, you can see this video. And merci, thank you, eskerrik asko.
Un immense merci Jasone pour ce exposé. Thank you very much. So much. Maintenant, je vais vous présenter Marisa Cavalli, donc de l'Institut régional de recherche du Val d'Aoste. Et maintenant, voilà, mais qui s'occupe à présent d'expertise pour le CELV, donc le Centre européen des langues vivantes du Conseil de l'Europe, donc ICML, et qui va donc proposer une réponse et des liens avec ce que Jasone a pu présenter. Merci Marisa.
Tu veux. Merci. Alors je commence par te remercier Nathalie parce que je crois que l'organisation de ce symposium, de ce colloque est vraiment une initiative formidable. Et je te remercie de m'y avoir invité. Je remercie aussi tous les collègues et organisateurs qui ont coopéré avec toi pour cette initiative. Et je voudrais essayer de vous dire comment je vois ce colloque, puis je passerai à des commentaires plus spécifiques. On peut passer à la page 2.
Oui, attends, oui. Je vais partager pour les collègues qui sont dans l'autre salle, mais tu peux commencer tranquillement et puis je vais pouvoir partager.
Voilà. Alors, il me semble que c'est une occasion absolument extraordinaire qui ressemble un peu à une rencontre entre deux mondes. Je pense que vous devinez lesquels, qui n'ont pas vraiment de grandes occasions de se rencontrer, de discuter, d'échanger, c'est-à-dire l'anglo-américanophonie et la francophonie. Voilà, tu peux dérouler.
Le faire
non, je vais le faire. Merci, merci infiniment. Ça, c'est la... Oh, où est-ce que je ne sais pas, mais je dois cliquer.
Ici. Oh, attends.
Hein?
Non, ici, tout simplement.
Ah, d'accord. Non, il paraît que ça ne marche pas. Attends. Ça? Moi, il me semble que c'est ça. Non.
Tu es bloqué.
Voilà, d'accord. Alors, je peux continuer. Et dans cette... du point de vue, comment dire, plus humain et moins scientifique, disons d'abord c'est une occasion pour moi et c'est assez extraordinaire. Hier aussi, j'ai passé un bon moment à table avec d'autres intervenants pour rencontrer enfin, après avoir lu ces textes, ces documents, ces articles, de rencontrer en personne Madame Jasone Cenoz. Je me suis entraînée toute la soirée hier, que je remercie infiniment pour cette présentation très complète, très exhaustive et dont je partage entièrement tous les principes. Et aussi une occasion festive presque de rencontrer tous les anciens collègues, mon mari l'appelle le village Vilaine. Et dans cette session spécifique, je voudrais quand même souligner l'importance de parler enfin de langues minoritaires et de leur contribution qui est pluridécennale, au moins à partir de la deuxième moitié du siècle dernier, juste à l'issue de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, et contribution donnée à la réflexion sur le biplurilinguisme et dans l'éducation. Et pour parler de ce que moi, je continue d'appeler alternance delle lingue ou alternance des langues ou alternance codique. Alors, moi aussi, j'appartiens à une toute minorité, c'est le Val d'Ost. Vous voyez vraiment une toute petite région. Vous avez absolument raison, Madame Cenoz. C'est une petite région qui est totalement entourée de montagnes. Donc, c'est une toute petite cellule qui est un espace vraiment où plusieurs langues vivent ensemble. Pourquoi je veux vous présenter ça? Parce que vous verrez que c'est un cas un peu particulier. Tout d'abord, tous les principes binaires qui étaient à la mode quand on a fait nos réformes bilingues, c'est-à-dire une langue, une personne, une langue, une école, une discipline et une langue, ont été complètement Qu'est-ce que je fais? Je perds le temps précieux. Ah, je fais seulement comme ça.
Ouais.
Tic, 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 tic. Voilà. Donc, ils ont été complètement abolis, mis de côté. Je vous expliquerai pourquoi. Et d'autres principes ont été assumés. Tic. Voilà. Chez nous, il y a une utilisation paritaire de l'italien et du français. Dans toutes les activités didactiques, donc dans toutes les disciplines, par tous les enseignants, par tous les élèves. Et bon, évidemment, ce modèle se fonde sur l'alternance planifiée des langues, pensée dans notre cas comme une reformulation linguistique, conceptuelle des contenus. Et on adopte une conception bilingue du bilinguisme, psycholinguistique. Je pense à M. Grosjean. C'est-à-dire, vous dites que le translanguaging, il y a le spontané et il y a le non spontané. Nous pensions que l'alternance codique était un mode de fonctionnement du bilingue et que donc il nous était permis d'alterner les langues également à l'école. Donc, on a renversé un peu l'argumentaire. Alternance des langues, pourquoi? Parce que c'est tout d'abord un choix politique. Les politiques ont décidé de ne pas créer des fissures, des fractures dans le corps social. Ils ont décidé qu'il n'y aurait pas des familles qui parleraient français et d'autres pas, et donc on a fait ce choix. Et les personnes qui travaillent dans les langues ont dû trouver des argumentaires, des théories, et on est allé les chercher. Et on les a trouvés, il y a longtemps. Et donc, expérimentation avec les enseignants, recherche-action, en ont fait un instrument en vue d'une meilleure construction des connaissances disciplinaires. Et là, ce matin, j'ai participé à un atelier sur les disciplines et j'ai trouvé peu de disciplines. Et je trouve que dans votre liste, il manque cette réflexion, mais que sans doute vous avez fait ailleurs, sur les disciplines. Alors, la minorité basque, que je vous dise d'abord toute mon admiration, parce que je trouve que c'est une des politiques, avec la politique catalane aussi, des plus outillées, sociolinguistiquement, pédagogiquement, etc. Et donc, j'ai toujours admiré. Elle est bien outillée, cette politique linguistique. On a essayé de vous copier dans certaines choses. J'ai visité votre minorité, dont je la connais de près, et j'ai vu qu'on a fait des efforts considérables, mais pour mettre des ressources aussi pour mettre en œuvre cette politique linguistique que vous venez d'illustrer de façon vraiment splendide avec toutes ces données. D'abord, moi j'ai vu une formation pluriannuelle sur la langue et la pédagogie aussi, réalisée organisés dans des centres linguistiques perdus dans la campagne, construits exprès pour travailler avec les ancestors. Une lucidité hors du commun dans des situations de politique et linguistique, et parce que vous n'avez pas seulement, comme on le fait souvent, confié la basquisation de la société à l'école, en disant tu te débrouilles, ils doivent devenir bilingues. Moi, je me souviens avoir visité un plateau de télévision où on était en train d'enregistrer des émissions, une soap opéra en basque, qui, il paraît, était vraiment beaucoup suivie par tous les locuteurs de basque. Une politique linguistique qui évalue depuis toujours, parce que vous le faites depuis toujours, son impact. Chez nous, la recherche sur ces questions-là est trop délicate. On ne peut pas y toucher, on ne peut pas faire une recherche quantitative ou qualitative sur ce genre de choses. Et enfin, moi je trouve extraordinaire que quand même, parmi les modèles démocratiquement soumis au choix des familles, c'est quand même le modèle où le basque est à la priorité surtout, qui est celui qui gagne tout. Alors, pourquoi je parle de votre minorité, de la mienne? Parce que je considère que les minorités linguistiques, ce sont des contextes qui sont spécifiques avec des particularités historiques, culturelles, politiques, sociales, qui ne les rendent pas parfaitement comparables. Mais les minorances linguistiques connaissent mieux que d'autres contextes les problèmes et les opportunités que peut offrir une éducation en 2 ou plusieurs langues. Ce n'est pas un cas que c'est St. Williams, d'une minorité cloisonnée en Angleterre, qui nous a donné ce concept de translanguaging que je traduirai par alternanza delle lingue. Alors, malheureusement, chacune de ces petites micro-communautés réfléchit dans son propre coin pour rencontrer dans des rencontres vraiment tout à fait au hasard que les problèmes sont communs, les solutions similaires et qu'elles peuvent être adaptées dans des contextes très différents. Par exemple, je pense aux briefing spaces. Nous nous sommes posé la question, mais avec la liberté d'alterner les langues, est-ce que le français ne pâtira pas par rapport à l'italien et qu'on finira par faire en sorte que tous les élèves ne parleront qu'italien? Nous avons résolu cela par la notion de contradidactique qu'on a élaborée avec Laurent Gaillot, et qui était de se dire, d'abord, il faut penser à des espaces où parfois c'est une seule langue, parfois c'est l'autre langue, parfois c'est des espaces plurilingues où on peut alterner les langues. Pensons encore au translanguaging planifié, comme vous dites. Nous avons gardé quand même alternanza delle lingue qui n'est pas planifié. On s'est dit que si on peut planifier au niveau méso, par exemple l'histoire, un sujet historique, on va le penser en différentes parties, l'une en français, l'autre en italien, dont on planifie. Dans la classe, la micro-alternance, celle quand un mot manque, quand une expression n'est pas là, les élèves sont bien conscients qu'il s'agit de l'autre langue. Il faut comme ça, ben, d'accord, je dois continuer mon discours, non? Et donc, cette micro-alternance est toujours permise parce que, selon certains théoriciens suisses, c'est des occasions, des séquences, on ouvre des séquences parallèles où des acquisitions sont toujours possibles. Alors, maintenant, je passerai à cette alternance des langues dans la construction des connaissances disciplinaires. Vous avez une liste des principes pour un translanguaging soutenable pour les minorités linguistiques. Et moi, il me semble que cette dimension des disciplines, vous ne l'avez pas mise comme 7e point possible. Et c'est là que nous avons par contre beaucoup travaillé. Oui. je formulerai le problème que nous avons essayé de résoudre avec une question. Comment alterner les langues de façon à ce que leur interaction soit au bénéfice aussi bien des disciplines que de la conceptualisation disciplinaire et bien sûr des langues parce que ça c'est donné comme acquis. Et c'est-à-dire, voilà, comment faire de l'alternance linguistique, de l'alternance des langues, ou du translanguaging, ou du pedagogical translanguaging, si vous voulez, un instrument de décentration épistémologique par rapport aux disciplines scolaires. On n'enseigne pas l'histoire en Italie comme on l'enseigne en France, ni les sciences. Et donc, comment on peut faire en sorte que ces différences de construction de connaissances scolaires puissent enrichir l'acquisition des connaissances disciplinaires. Montrer qu'il y a quand même des modèles qui sont très différents. Que Jules César, d'un côté, est un bon dictateur, un empereur, et de l'autre côté, c'est un dictateur. Alors donc, il s'agit de questions qui sont essentiellement épistémologiques, cognitives, et qui touchent au savoir, pas uniquement aux langues et au destin des savoirs. Et cette question se réfère aux défis qui sont les plus intéressants à mon avis, non seulement pour le succès scolaire des étudiants et pour leur avenir, mais également pour le futur des rapports de domination entre les langues dans l'élaboration de la connaissance humaine. Parce que je crois qu'il y en a qui s'endorment maintenant que je parle français. Bon, translanguaging. Translanguaging est tombé sur nos têtes, nous qui travaillons depuis longtemps, comme une parole slogan. On n'arrivait pas à traduire, sinon par alternance des langues, qui s'est répandue d'une façon extraordinaire, mais de façon planétaire, vraiment complètement éliminant d'autres concepts qui étaient bien présents dans l'histoire des minorités linguistiques. On dirait que c'est un concept qui n'a pas de base vraiment historique sur tous les travaux qu'on a faits en Europe sur cette question-là et en lien avec les minorités linguistiques. Donc, on a remplacé notre alternance codique, puis comme c'est la mode d'assumer des termes américains ou français à la place des français, ça a remplacé même alternance codique. Mais surtout, Monsieur Lee a montré, a montré tout à l'heure son manifeste, le manifeste qu'il a écrit avec Ophélia Garcia. Si vous lisez ce texte, translanguaging est lié à des notions qui ne me semblent absolument pas acceptables dans nos contextes. Premièrement, la notion de named languages. Certes, même en Europe, le répertoire est vu comme un ensemble de langues fluides dans la tête du locuteur, mais c'est quand même l'enfant le plus fragile saura s'il parle dans une langue ou dans une autre. Et encore plus dangereuse, parce que ça, je la trouve vraiment dangereuse comme notion, c'est la conception du langage académique comme, certes, une construction humaine, il faut bien l'admettre, c'est nous qui l'avons inventé, mais comme toujours un héritage d'une culture, là je me suis presque sentie offensée, qui est d'origine blanche, qui est européenne, et qui a des attitudes encore coloniales, et qui, en tant que telle, ne doit pas être enseignée. Pensez aux élèves fragiles, et nous en avons parlé d'équité et tout. C'est des enfants à qui il faut apprendre les langages complexes que l'école propose. Qu'est-ce que je veux encore dire? Je ne veux pas conclure. Mais je vais tout simplement vous donner un souhait qui est largement, comment dire, compensé par ce que j'entends dans les ateliers. Je voudrais, parmi ces gens tous vous travaillez à la recherche, à la formation, aux concepts scientifiques liés à l'enseignement et aux langues, simplement vous dire on ne peut plus se passer du monde de la pratique. Le monde de la pratique est le monde qui est le plus proche de l'humain, donc le plus proche de la complexité. Et je veux dire du monde de la pratique qu'il porte tout le poids actuel des innovations sociétales sur lesquelles nous réfléchissons souvent de façon abstraite, sans penser vraiment tout au fond quelles sont les conséquences que ces réflexions-là peuvent avoir sur ces élèves-là. Et attendez. Hein? Oh non, non.
Merci beaucoup Marisa. Donc maintenant on va laisser la parole à la salle pour quelques questions. Donc, je vous en prie, je vais amener le micro comme ça les collègues qui sont dans la salle de vous entendre.
Bonjour, eskerrik asko Jasone, grazie tante Marisa, Encarnación Carrasco, Universitat de Barcelona, Facultat d'Educació. J'ai une question pour toi, Jasone. Tu comprends le français?
Oui.
Oui, mais avant tout, je voulais te remercier, Marisa, parce que je me sens moins seule. Avec ta vision critique sur, sur les termes, sur deux mondes scientifiques, épistémologiques qui se tournent le dos, je pense, qui ignorent les uns les travaux des autres. Et ce matin, avec l'exposition de M. Wade, il y avait un moment où il y avait une diapo, il y avait une définition de... C'était translanguaging. Et alors j'ai dit à Daniel Coste, qui était à côté de moi, j'ai dit, mais si on allait translanguaging, moi je mettrais éducation plurilingue telle que je l'ai toujours comprise, et pour moi c'est valable la définition. Donc bravo pour ton courage, parce que tu as eu le courage de dire des choses que beaucoup on pense depuis longtemps. Et je pense que c'est bon pour la science et pour avancer. Ce n'est pas une question de lutte, de savoir qui a raison ou qui a travaillé avant que l'autre sur certains sujets. Donc, je t'en remercie infiniment. Jasone, mi pregunta es respecto al translanguaging pedagógico y a los tres modelos vascos A, B y D. Ahora la traduciré en francés. Si preconizáis, supongo, como dosis diferentes, ¿no? Los diferentes modelos. Je lui demande si dans les trois modèles basques A, B et D, donc il préconise une utilisation, un dosage différent du translanguaging. Et merci beaucoup à toutes les deux, c'est vraiment un réel plaisir.
Merci.
Le microphone.
Et Elna? Ah bon.
No, yeah. Okay, thanks. Is it working? Yeah. Thanks for the question. We have implemented pedagogical translanguaging in schools, mainly in the D model, in the Basque medium education, because there are a lot more schools now in the Basque medium. And we are still checking in which years and how intense it can be, because it depends on the situation and mainly on the sociolinguistic area. But the idea, when we have implemented a pedagogical translanguaging, at first the school was kind of completely afraid of that, and mainly in the case of Basque. You are going to use Spanish and English in the Basque class? This type of idea, right? And then, but we said, but we are going to be extremely careful to compensate that for the use of Basque in the English and Spanish class also. Doing it in a coordinated way. It's not that you reduce the exposure to Basque. And it has been quite interesting to see the results, but also what teachers perceive about that. And they were quite convinced about what they had done in their classes. And one thing that they also said, and this is always, the voices from the minority language, that they were saying it was very rewarding for us to have Basque at the same level as Spanish and English. That we had a table, because it's always this idea that Basque is always the one that has fewer things and so on. So it was in a way, in a kind of status also, it was important to have it. But we have not tried in the A model or the B model. We have not tried that, but it could be different because you have to adapt it to the context.
D'autres questions? Pas d'autres questions. Alors, on a déjà pris du retard pour les ateliers, donc on va vous laisser voir les communicants dans les différents ateliers. Et ensuite, on se retrouvera donc en face du jardin d'hiver pour un goûter, avant la suite des ateliers. Il faut aussi manger.
Thank you. No, I enjoyed yours very much. I mean, it was very good.